welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we have a special episode for you, and that is we're going to be looking at the Lost Colony of Roanoke and the Outer Banks of North Carolina, known today as Manio. Chris, this is I used to think this was one of those stories of history that everybody knew, that everybody was familiar with. But over the years, as I've talked to people and taught American history, I've learned two things. Number one, not everybody knows about it. And number two, even those who know about it don't know a lot about it. So even though this may be a more popular topic, this is something that this is a little bit of history here that a lot of people don't know.
Yeah, really, because many people put Roanoke and get it confused with Jamestown.
Yeah.
And while we do recognize that Jamestown was the first permanent colony that was established here in the New World, the reality is long before Jamestown, there was Roanoke Island. And it's a fascinating story that comes straight out of a novel, you would think. It's got intrigue, it's got violence, it's got all kinds of different characters that have some great personalities to them, but there's also a lot of sadness with this. And it's a story that is still, even today in 2021, still unsolved. And it's one of those great mysteries that people, once they find out about it, they want more. And so I do think that it is history that we should know, and that we should really understand the trials, the tragedies, and the triumphs that came in this first venture into Roanoke. And I look forward to discussing it with you and with our listeners today.
Yeah, this story has it all. It has monarchs, it has a queen, it has armies, it has natives, it has, actually, a lot of people don't know this, it has war, it has missing people, and it has an entire colony at the end of the day that, from our perspective, disappeared. One historian once said that the lost colony was not lost. They knew right where they were. They're just simply lost to us. So, Chris, let's just go ahead and dive in here. Of course, we're going back to the 16th century, the late 16th century to be exact. Queen Elizabeth I is reigning there in England. And of course, she has been in conflict with Spain for a number of years. Spain has, of course, put in a lot of resources into what today we would call Central America and Mexico and the Caribbean. And of course, they are down there. They are getting gold and treasures, and they are bringing those gold and treasures out of Central America, and they're taking them back to Spain. And Queen Elizabeth, like so many monarchs in Europe at the time, she's not happy to sit there and let Spain rack up on all the money and all the jewels that are coming out of Central America. So she hires a group of what she referred to as sea dogs, which were basically government-backed pirates who were there to capture these Spanish ships and get as much of the loot off those ships as they could. And her initial vision, Chris, for what we today call Roanoke was really a military base to launch ships from and to sort of help fight the battle there against Spain.
Ever since the beginning of civilization, there has always been lust for power, for gold, for glory. And just as we talk about Christopher Columbus and coming over for God and for glory and using guns, here we see once again that same mentality. You have this queen who is determined that she will not be number 2 in the world rankings, or even number 3, because France is heavily involved in wanting to explore and colonize the New World as well. So we have this unquenchable thirst for knowledge, for power, but also there's religious issues going into this as well. And so what is happening during this particular time is the Queen is looking for individuals who will do her dirty business, if you will, to allow her to find success, to have conquered the greatest prizes, the greatest glory. And the only way you could do that was, of course, to plunder from what the Spanish were claiming each and every day. And so she involves an individual whose name is Sir Walter Raleigh, this dashing 28-year-old individual. And together they come up with this plan that if they could establish a secure, and this is important, a secure base, like you mentioned, a secure military base in America, then they would be able to fit their ships, to repair their ships on the American coast, that they can collect payments from others coming by the particular colony. They can attract investors, but they can also harass Spanish shipping, and they can lay their own claim to North America. The problem was, where on earth do you do this? They asked for advice. They called in some of the greatest minds and said, where do you think it would be good to do this? And one of the guys, his name was Richard Hakluyt. He said, you want to be careful. You don't go too close to Florida because that's where the Spanish garrisons are. You don't want to go too close to the Caribbean because of the dangers with the currents and issues. And so they decide it needs to be a place that is north of Florida, but along the mid-Atlantic, a place that will be remote from Spanish naval bases, but also allow for inshore waters that will allow them to travel up the different canals and rivers of North America. And that's how we get to Roanoke.
And Walter Raleigh was a great choice for Queen Elizabeth. And he comes to her attention through his service in Ireland. Ireland was, of course, rebelling against the English, their English overlords. And Walter Raleigh was sent in there, and he helped put down that rebellion and oversaw the execution of over 600 residents of a particular town. So his service there in Ireland attracted the attention of Queen Elizabeth, who, of course, was looking for brave leaders to be the ones to sort of take up the cause of going to the New World and this location that they were going to pick. Like you said, they had to pick a location far enough away from the Spanish to be safe, but at the same time, close enough to be able to be used for privateering. And so he got two ships, and in April 27 of 1584, Philip Amadeus led the expedition while Arthur Barlow captained a smaller vessel, and they landed in the New World of all days, Chris, July 4, at what is believed to be Hatteras Island. They're on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, though that particular idea is still debated. But one thing, Chris, that they find when they arrive off the coast of what is today North Carolina and the Outer Banks is it is what later explorers would refer to as the goodliest land under the cope of heaven. They found ducks and fish and fowl of all different sorts, and just endless amounts of land and trees and resources, which, of course, coming from England at that particular time wasn't necessarily something they were used to.
And it's interesting because we talk about coming to the New World, and when this first expedition takes place, coming to the New World, yes, those two boats that had these people coming to try to find a suitable site where they could establish, residency, was full of soldiers, which seems to suggest that even before the ships pulled out of England, that Raleigh was prepared and expected to come across hostile natives, and he was ready to defend their group from that happening. And what actually happens is they arrive on the land, and they actually talk about that they have this kind of worship service when they go to Hatteras, or what we call today Hatteras. They take possession of the land in in honor of the Queen's most excellent majesty. And they had this formal declaration of sovereignty. And there were no natives that were present to witness the events, that they had just all of a sudden taken ownership of land that really wasn't even their land. But while they didn't see the natives saw them. And the natives saw the ships of Barlow and Amadis, and they didn't know. Were these guys here to trade? Were they here to fight? Did they come to settle? What was the purpose of these strange men in these two boats that had just landed on their land? And so the story is told that these three natives approached the ships when they landed, and they went out to meet them, and that these soldiers, Amadis and Barlow's soldiers, actually took the Indians back to the ship, gave them a shirt, gave them hats, and you could tell that it started out that there was some pretty good relationship, that everything seemed to be going pretty well. I mean, they were welcomed by the natives. The Englishmen returned the welcome. Everybody gave gifts that seemed to signify that they wanted to trade, that they had peaceful intentions. The natives told them about the animals that were around. And so the strangers to the natives seemed to be friends. And all of a sudden, things just seemed to turn really, really quick.
Yeah, that first trip by Barlow was, I think, a little bit more of a success than subsequent trips were. Richard Granville, he's going to come over, and he's going to be the leader, the governor of a new colony, a new attempt. Actually, it wasn't even a colony; it was an attempt at creating this military base, this place to pursue Spanish ships. And he's going to bring over another army, but he's also going to bring two men with him, Chris. One is Thomas Harriot, who, of course, Thomas Harriot was an author. He was a scientist, and he was interested in coming over and studying the wildlife and the biology here in the New World. And then, of course, John White. And John White's going to feature very prominently when we actually talk about the third colony that's going to take residence here at Roanoke. But John White is going to actually be a painter, a drawer, and he's going to create wonderful images, not just simply of fish and birds and that, but also of the natives that he comes in contact with, the villages he sees. And they published a book called A Brief and True Report of the Newfound Land of Virginia. And I have a copy of that particular book, and it is amazing to look at and to think that he was a very good artist and was able to draw some wonderful some pictures there that sort of give us an idea of what life was actually like. You're reading it, but you also get to see what life was actually like. And Chris, I can just imagine being back in England, being Queen Elizabeth, or being somebody else in her court or whatever, and reading that or having that read to you, and just your imagination is running wild of these things that they have seen there. And like you said, things are going to quickly go south between these two groups, because there's a big communication gap between the two groups, and that's going to create a lot of problems.
Not only the communication problem, but the colonists begin to have an overdependence on the natives for food, which during the winter months is increasingly difficult to supply. And the other issue that really probably sets things apart is that the natives begin to get sick. Yeah. And they experience this terrible toll on their tribe because of these European diseases that start coming over as these colonists are coming over. And so all of a sudden, you start to see tension. You're taking all of our food, you're getting all of our people sick, you've taken our land, and we feel like we're being pushed back and back and back. And so while the news in England to Queen Elizabeth is, hey, We found a place. It's a really good location. It's beautiful. It's going to allow us to have a great colony. You got Sir Walter Raleigh, who's extremely excited because he's the one that originated this plan, and the Queen's happy with him, and he's happy with what's going on, and he all of a sudden sees glory and he sees gold in his mind. So we have two different tales of what's really going on in Roanoke during this particular time. And so Raleigh and Queen Elizabeth, based on the book, based on the map, based on the drawings, says, hey, let's try to send not just soldiers over, but let's really make this an establishment. Let's look at bringing over men and women and children and really start to develop this particular place. And so White is pretty much put in charge of the colony and the organization of the trip to go over there. And so White spends a great deal of time meeting with family and friends and trying to persuade people to join him on this great crusade that they were about to go. And I thought that it was interesting that they were trying to attract men and women of modest means who would be willing to invest their own work ethic, their own resources to kind of establish the colony so that it wouldn't just be given to them. And, and so Raleigh said, well, when you get there, I want you to establish it as the city of Raleigh. That's what I want it to be called. Not that he was prideful or anything, but he really thought that this new colony was going to rival some of the great English ports that were over in England that were doing really, really well. And so he says, I want John White to be in charge of it. He's got the task of founding it and preparing for the arrival of more colonists. And so during the winter and spring of 1586 and 1587, what did they get? I think it was 92 men, 17 women, and 9 children that are going to join together to make the trip.
Mm-hmm. Roughly, yeah. He's gonna put together a trip. I think I read somewhere that he had actually persuaded 116 people to come to the colonies. And as you said, these were not military folks. These were not people like Ralph Lane brought with him. These were women and men and children that were coming to the New World on this particular new journey to create not just simply a military base, but an actual colony where people would live and work and do all that kind of thing. And as you said, they wanted to create the city of Raleigh, but interestingly enough, he did not want to do it at Roanoke. The situation under Ralph Lane's leadership, the previous colony, had ended so poorly that they thought it would be better to go somewhere else. And also there was the issue of the depth of the water at Roanoke that caused problems for larger ships. So they were going to go more toward the Chesapeake, where the water was deeper and would be able to accommodate those larger ships. This colony left, of course, England on May 8, 1587. And they eventually arrive here in the New World, Chris, and things don't turn out the way they hoped they would. There's tension between John White and one of the captains of the ship, and they end up landing exactly where they didn't want to land. That is right there back in Roanoke, which the natives there still remembered what happened last time some English were there.
And I think it's important. It's so easy for us that we can easily say that they left the port of England and they arrived in Roanoke.
Yeah.
But what we also have to remember is the journey itself. The journey. I mean, John White wrote in his journal on May 8th, quote, "We weighed anchor at Plymouth and departed thence for Virginia," end quote. And you read that, and it really doesn't capture the significance of the moment, because what they were doing in that journey is laying the foundations of an English America that would last for generations upon generations But the journey to, as you mentioned, it got off to a horrendous start, not even when they arrived at the wrong place, but just the discomforts of the long voyage. You got seasickness. People haven't been on a boat across the Atlantic before. I mean, they're nauseated. They're having a difficult time. They're also scared to death that the Spanish warships who are out there are going to attack them. Or what about pirates? Or what about storms? Or, what happens if they run out of food or if there's a disease? And so they're putting up with all of these terrible, terrible situations. And we also have to remember that, yes, there were men, there were women, and there were children, but it must have been extremely hard on two individuals, Eleanor Dare and Marjorie Harvey, who by mid-June on the journey were about 8 months pregnant. And you see that they stop over, I think, somewhere in the tropics, and they find these little small fruits that look like green apples, but they turned out to be poisonous. It burned their mouths and their tongues so badly they weren't able to speak. They were drinking contaminated water. And all of a sudden, as you mentioned, the relationship between the settlers on the boat and the mariners and the captain, they didn't get along on this journey. And so you can kind of see that when they finally do arrive in Roanoke, they're battered, they're beaten, they're tired, they're wondering, was it worth it? Is this really what we needed to do? And here they are arriving and saying, what do we do now?
And of course, when they arrive at Roanoke, things are not going to go better initially. They're there on the island for a number of days. They do not see any of the local native population at all. There's no attempt by the local natives to reach out to them. Of course, bitter over what happened under Ralph Lane's colony. And a guy called George Howe, one of the colonists there at Roanoke, wanders away from the group. He is in shallow water. Apparently, he's crabbing, looking for crabs, and he is attacked by a number of warriors. And John White says that they gave him 16 wounds, and then they killed him with their swords. And of course, this is going to cause alarm, obviously, on the part of this colony. So a number of them are going to go over to Croatoan, which was a nearby island, the home of Manteo. And he was going to be more friendly to the colonists there at Roanoke. He's actually going to prove to be a lifesaver for these people.
Yeah, and we have to, the reason that we told the beginnings of this story is because it is so important, that we understand that in an instant, this beautiful place that had been written about in the drawings and everything that White had talked about, all of a sudden takes on a whole new character, because these men, women, and children, they don't know what lies behind the trees in the forest or what's happening at the water's edge. They no longer feel safe. And, as we move forward with this, we have to keep in mind that the language barrier and also past experiences is always so difficult to overcome. And we see that happening was it Manteo, I think, that they come into contact with and try to start resolving some of the issues that had been going on and trying to find some sort of resolve. Was it Manteo?
Yeah, it was Manteo, and it's going to get difficult. It's going to be dicey. Manteo sticks with them, but it is going to be dicey. In August, I believe it's in August, some colonists from Roanoke actually attack Croatoan Indians, having misidentified them. They thought they were another tribe that had been hostile to them. But of course, White and Manteo were able to sort of work this out. to where the two sides did not go to war over that particular situation. And of course, so John White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, is going to give birth to Virginia Dare, who's going to be the first English settler to be born in the New World. And Chris, if you go to Manio today and you go to the Elizabethan Gardens, there's a statue sort of tucked away somewhere of what Virginia Dare may have looked like as a young woman. And of course, we ultimately don't know what happened to Virginia Dare, because shortly after her birth, the colony is going to decide that John White, its governor, needs to return to England to gather supplies. And he is going to go to England with the idea of being back in just a few months. And Chris, he's going to be gone for 3 years.
Yeah, he's gone for 3 years. And this is so off topic, but I've got to say it because I think it's interesting. The birth of Virginia Dare, which is fascinating, and it kind of brings a sense of good news. This is about 3 weeks after, the terrible death of George Howe, and it kind of restores their optimism, I guess, that maybe it's a sign that the English are going to succeed after all in America. But what I think is interesting is, remember, there were 2 pregnant women on board of the boat as they came across, and like 2 days later, Marjorie had her child. And so I just, you got to feel sorry for Marjorie, because nobody even pays attention to Marjorie. It's all about Virginia Dare. As you just mentioned, there's the marker about Virginia Dare. She was the first. And even though Marjorie's child was like 2 days later, nobody pays attention to her. She is forgotten in the course of
the middle child.
Yes, nobody cares about that middle child. You missed out. You should have been earlier. And I don't know. I mean, you have to find some humor in this terrible tragedy, especially as things are just going to go from bad to worse. Because as you mentioned, everybody goes to White and says, with one voice, he says, "Please go to England," and he didn't want to go.
No, he doesn't.
Because
I've actually read some speculation. Why was it White they sent back? He was the governor of the colony. It seemed to some, it seems like it was a strange request to send him back, and may have indicated there were some issues. I don't know if that was the case or not, but it's certainly an interesting request that they go to him and ask him to be the one to go back, and of course not somebody else.
Well, and I also think that White was really close to Raleigh. They were really tight, and I think White knew what Raleigh's true purpose was, and I think Raleigh really trusted White more than he would have trusted any of the other guys. And so I really think that White had to go because he was the most qualified to get the supplies, to get additional settlers, that Raleigh probably wouldn't have listened to anybody else. But because of his drawings, because of the previous attempts, that I think that was maybe one of the things to do. But still, what a heartbreaking decision that had to be made. I mean, on the one hand, he was convinced his duty was to remain in Virginia. But on the other hand, the settlers believed he was needed more in London. So he's leaving behind his newborn daughter, leaving behind his daughter, his newborn granddaughter. He's leaving behind friends, and he's going on this long journey. And let's be real. Does he really have 100% certainty that he'll ever see them ever again?
No, and it's interesting that there were issues going back. He almost didn't make it back to England. The Atlantic crossing back then was no guarantee. If you set out over the Atlantic, there was no guarantee you were going to arrive where you sought to arrive. But he does arrive in England, and unfortunately, when he arrives, all of England's ships, Queen Elizabeth has sort of recalled all of their ships because of a conflict with Spain and the Spanish Armada. And it's not until March of 1590 that John White is able to once again set sail for his colony. And he took 4 ships with him, and they crossed the Atlantic. But of course, they're not going to go straight to Roanoke because these ships are not really going to be under his control. The ships are piloted by people who are really more interested, let's be honest, in capturing Spanish shipping and getting rich. But they do go to the spot on August 18, 1590, where John White's colony was. Of course, as you've noticed, as you noted earlier, they sang songs, they fired cannons and guns, and they received no response. And when they went on the shore, of course, they found native footprints and the letter CRO carved in the tree.
Yeah, I think it's important that they did have a plan of action when White left. They had said, okay, let's talk about what's going to happen. And the settlers had said, hey, if we decide to go off and explore, if we go look at other places or whatever it might be, we promise we're going to leave a small contingent here on Roanoke Island. That way we can kind of keep touch of everything that's going on. So that way, when you return to Roanoke, we'll be able to tell you where everybody is, what's happening, and what's going on. So they kind of had this plan in place. And even when he comes back and, he writes in his journal that he saw, quote, a great smoke rise in the Isle Roanoke near the place where I left our colony in 1587. And he said that smoke had put him in good hope that the colony were there expecting his return from England. And so they had made plans that they were going to fire the cannon, they were going to sing hymns, that they were going to do all of these great things. But when they got off and they went to look, they found that no one was there.
Yeah, it wasn't just that no one was there. White remarks in his journal that the houses had been taken up. They hadn't been burned down, they hadn't been knocked down, they hadn't been neglected. It was just like the people packed everything up and left. John White sort of assumes that they were at Croatoan. I mean, he saw CRO on the tree, he saw CRO Croatoan on the fence post. And I think that when he heads back to England, which he ultimately will do, he goes back thinking that's where his granddaughter and his daughter and son-in-law and his colony is.
Can we just, and let's put the personal touch on this. Here's John White,
right,
taking this journey, having left his family, going to England, being delayed for 3 years. Imagine what was on his mind when he finally gets back to the island. He sees smoke and he says, okay, everything's looking good. But then he's probably wondering, are they going to be mad at me? Because I had promised that I would return with supplies as soon as possible. And here I am 3 years later. And by the way, he's coming back with nothing. Mm-hmm. But just him and some group. They lost everything on the journey over. So how is he going to explain his long absence? How is he going to explain that, hey, I'm bringing you no goods, no reinforcements, when you depended on me to bring back the very thing? And I didn't bring back anything, much less it took me 3 years to bring nothing back. So you got that issue going on in his mind. And then the issue that, where are they? Yeah. And then he sees, as you said, the CRO, and he says, oh, good. Okay. So they went with some good individuals. Everything's going to be fine today. We're going to be okay. But then there comes the realization that White knew it was unlikely he would probably ever see his family or the settlers again. And the fact that his buddy who had started the adventure, Raleigh, had pretty much moved past the Lost or Roanoke. He had decided he was focusing on things in Ireland. He was focusing, actually, a whole nother story. He was a little jealous because the Queen had seemed to have eyes for another pursuer, and he didn't like that. And so here's the main investor who's given up on Roanoke, who's given up on the settlers, and White is found in the middle, having lost everything.
And there really wasn't any major search attempts. There were some ships that would go by the area and see. And in 1607, after Jamestown arrived, there was an expedition and some investigations. But there was really no major effort to find the Roanoke colonists. And you mentioned something a minute ago that I wanted to mention again about the colonists possibly being angry. He was gone 3 years, and maybe they left, maybe they went to Croatoan, maybe some went to the Chowan River area, maybe some went up to the Chesapeake. Whatever happened to them, Chris, I can imagine by 1607, the ones that remained, they had started new lives. They had moved on, and they may not have been interested in going back.
We all know that the story of Roanoke Island has been passed down throughout the years and is now known as the Lost Colony. And we know that there's all kinds of theories and ideas that are out there as far as, what happened, what's the ending, what's the solution. And whereas in math, we know that 2 + 2 is going to tell us that it's 4, the beauty of history is that there's always answers that remain unanswered. How do we end our time together talking about the Lost Colony? What's the end of the story, do you think?
I'm gonna end it by telling a story about a story, and that is, if you go to Roanoke during the summer, there's the play, the Lost Colony play, and it is a wonderful play. I fully endorse it. Anybody who has a chance to go up there and see that the historical site, the Elizabethan Gardens, but watch that play. And by the way, they're not paying me to say this. You should definitely do it. It is worth the time. It is worth the trip. But Chris, what I really liked about that play is they didn't try to answer the question, what happened to the Lost Colony?
Yeah.
They didn't try to solve that mystery, because ultimately everything we may say, well, this may have happened, that may have happened, it's all speculation. We can speculate and speculate and speculate, but ultimately we don't know. So I think maybe the best way to end it is the way they end it, and that is just to end it. All right. I hope everybody enjoyed this episode. We look forward to future episodes. And if you have any ideas, suggestions, comments, you can always contact us at email. That's historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. History, the letter you should know @gmail.com. Look us up on Facebook. We're on Twitter, Sounder FM. We're also on Google Podcast, and other platforms as well. So until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.